The Carter family home, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Columbia, South Carolina, was the epitome of tranquility. A well-manicured lawn framed the modest but inviting house, where neighbors often saw Trevor Carter mowing the grass or his wife, Melanie Carter, tending to her flower beds. To the outside world, their family was flawless: Trevor, a successful real estate agent, and Melanie, a devoted wife and mother, shared their home with their two children, Ella, a thoughtful teenager, and Jack, their rambunctious younger son. But on a morning that should have been like any other, Trevor stumbled into a nightmare that would shatter that perfect image forever. It began as Trevor left their bedroom, the soft creak of the floorboards breaking the morning silence. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, Melanie's usual morning ritual, was conspicuously absent. Trevor's brow furrowed as he glanced at the clock. She was an early riser, it was unlike her to sleep in. Concern gnawed at him as he moved through the house, calling her name. "Melanie? You up?" No response. The house felt eerily still. He glanced toward the children's rooms. Both Ella and Jack were still sound asleep. Relieved they were safe, he made his way toward the bathroom, the door ajar with a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. His pace quickened, the pit in his stomach growing heavier. When he pushed open the door, the scene before him stopped him cold. Melanie lay on the cold tiled floor, her body twisted unnaturally, her nightgown soaked in crimson. A gash across her throat stood out starkly against her pale skin, the unmistakable evidence of a brutal attack. Around her, signs of a struggle were everywhere: the shower curtain torn, bottles of toiletries scattered across the floor, a broken mirror reflecting the horror in fragmented pieces. Trevor staggered backward, his breath caught in his throat. "Melanie," he choked out, his voice breaking. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her lifeless body, too paralyzed to act. The metallic scent of blood filled his nostrils, mingling with the sharp tang of cleaning products. For a fleeting moment, he clung to the hope that she might still be alive, but the cold touch of her skin dashed that hope immediately. His trembling hands fumbled for his phone, the world around him blurring into a haze of panic and disbelief. Dialing 911 felt like moving through molasses. The operator's voice came through, calm and detached, as Trevor stammered out the details. "There's my wife. She's been attacked. She's not breathing." His voice cracked under the weight of his horror. The minutes stretched into an eternity before the first responders arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the early morning mist. Police officers and paramedics descended on the Carter home, transforming the once idyllic household into a grim crime scene. Trevor stood outside, his hands shaking, his mind racing with unanswerable questions. Who could have done this? Why Melanie? What had gone so horribly wrong? As detectives began their meticulous work, they noted the subtle signs of forced entry through the back door, left unlocked the night before. Trevor's initial grief was soon overshadowed by an overwhelming need to protect his children, still asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding just feet away. The perfect facade of the Carter family was shattered, leaving Trevor grappling with the devastating realization: someone had invaded their sanctuary, and they had taken everything from him. To those who knew them, the Carter family represented the pinnacle of suburban stability. Melanie Carter, with her warm smile and unwavering devotion, was the heart of the household. She spent her days managing the home, ensuring that Ella, her thoughtful 14-year-old daughter, and Jack, her spirited 10-year-old son, were always cared for. Her life revolved around carpool schedules, PTA meetings, and making sure the family's routines ran like clockwork. Trevor Carter, her husband, was equally admired. As a successful real estate agent, he worked long hours to provide for his family. But his demanding career often kept him away from home, leaving Melanie to shoulder most of the household responsibilities alone. The community admired their balance, but behind closed doors, Melanie felt an emptiness she couldn't explain. Their marriage, once filled with passion, had settled into a monotonous routine. Conversations were limited to logistics, grocery lists, bills, the kids' soccer schedules. The spark that had once brought them together seemed to have been extinguished by the weight of daily life. Melanie loved Trevor, but she couldn't deny the growing void between them. She told herself it was normal after so many years of marriage. Still, the nagging feeling of dissatisfaction lingered, leaving her longing for something more. That something more arrived one cold January morning, though she couldn't have anticipated how much it would alter the course of her life. It started with a minor inconvenience, a persistent leak in the kitchen faucet. Trevor had promised to fix it weeks ago, but his work commitments always seemed to take precedence. Frustrated, Melanie decided to handle it herself. She called a local plumbing service, and they sent Roy Harris, a rugged, soft-spoken man in his early 40s, to take care of the issue. When Roy arrived, Melanie was struck by his presence. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something magnetic about him, a quiet confidence, a steady gaze that seemed to see right through her. His clothes were worn but clean, and his calloused hands hinted at years of hard work. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a smile that felt disarmingly genuine. "It shouldn't take long," he said, kneeling to inspect the pipes. His voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the whirlwind of Melanie's usual life. As Roy worked, Melanie found herself lingering nearby, watching him with curiosity. They exchanged polite small talk at first, comments about the weather, the state of the neighborhood. But something about Roy invited more. His demeanor was easygoing but sincere, and Melanie, almost without realizing it, began opening up. She spoke about the kids, her busy days, and how Trevor's work often kept him away. "Sounds like you've got a full plate," Roy said, his tone sympathetic but not pitying. For reasons she couldn't explain, his words struck a chord. It had been so long since anyone had really listened to her, let alone acknowledged the weight she carried. When Roy finished fixing the leak, he left without fanfare. "Let me know if anything else comes up," he said with a smile. As he walked out the door, Melanie felt a strange pang of regret, as though she were losing something she hadn't even realized she wanted. Over the next few days, her thoughts kept drifting back to Roy. It wasn't just his appearance or his steady hands, it was the way he had made her feel seen. She tried to push the thoughts away, telling herself they were harmless, but they lingered like an uninvited guest. A few weeks later, when the bathroom sink began to clog, Melanie didn't hesitate. She called the same plumbing service, secretly hoping Roy would be the one to return. Her heart fluttered when he showed up at her door, toolbox in hand. This time, their conversation flowed even more easily. They spoke about their lives, their hopes, their struggles. Roy mentioned his background, how he had grown up fixing things, and his dream of one day owning his own business. Melanie found herself laughing more than she had in years, drawn to his honesty and the ease with which he shared pieces of himself. By the time Roy left that day, Melanie's mind was racing. She knew there was something between them, something unspoken but undeniably real. For the first time in years, she felt alive, as though a part of her that had been dormant was now awakening. She also knew that what she was feeling was dangerous. "This is nothing," she told herself, over and over. "Just a harmless connection." But deep down, Melanie felt the first faint stirrings of an attraction that she couldn't ignore. And she had no idea that the decision to call Roy would be the beginning of a path that would lead her life into chaos. The first time Melanie Carter kissed Roy Harris, it wasn't planned. It wasn't the product of careful deliberation or even a fleeting moment of impulsiveness. It happened almost like gravity, pulling two bodies together with a force that neither had the will, or perhaps the desire, to resist. It began with yet another minor inconvenience. The water pressure in the shower had started to fluctuate. While the problem wasn't severe, Melanie didn't hesitate to call Roy. She assured herself it was purely practical, she needed the issue fixed, and Roy had proven himself reliable. Yet, as she dialed his number, her fingers trembled, betraying the mix of excitement and guilt coursing through her veins. When Roy arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. There was something in the way his eyes lingered just a second too long on Melanie's face, the way her voice softened when she greeted him at the door. He carried his toolbox into the bathroom, his movement steady, while Melanie hovered in the hallway, unable to tear herself away. As Roy worked, their conversation moved beyond the small talk of their earlier meetings. They spoke of dreams deferred, the struggles of balancing expectations, and the quiet loneliness that had taken root in both their lives. Melanie found herself sharing things she had never said aloud, even to Trevor. "It's hard sometimes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feeling like you're invisible in your own life." Roy looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "You're not invisible," he said simply, his voice low and certain. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, Melanie stepped closer. The room seemed to shrink as she reached for him, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Their lips met in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deepened with a fervor that took them both by surprise. When they finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened crashed over Melanie like a tidal wave. Her cheeks flushed, and she stammered an apology, but Roy stopped her with a gentle touch on her arm. "Don't apologize," he said, his voice steady. "I've been feeling it too." That moment marked the beginning of their affair. What started as a kiss soon escalated into a series of secret meetings. Melanie and Roy became experts at hiding in plain sight. Roy would visit during the day, while Trevor was at work and the kids were at school. Melanie would watch the clock anxiously, counting down the minutes until he arrived. Their time together was intoxicating, a heady escape from the monotony of her life. They found solace in each other, but the weight of their secret grew heavier with each passing day. Melanie couldn't ignore the guilt that gnawed at her every time she saw Trevor or tucked Ella and Jack into bed. Yet, the thrill of her time with Roy outweighed her guilt, at least for now. He made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, like she was more than just a wife and mother, but a woman desired, seen, and valued. The affair didn't remain confined to her home for long. They began meeting at motels scattered across the city, places where no one would recognize them. Melanie became adept at crafting excuses, errands that needed running, lunches with friends that didn't exist. Trevor, ever trusting and distracted by work, didn't question her sudden absences. But secrecy came at a price. The more their relationship deepened, the more Melanie felt trapped between two worlds. She loved her family, but with Roy, she rediscovered a version of herself she had thought was long gone. She knew their relationship couldn't last, it was a house of cards destined to collapse. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to end it. Roy, too, seemed increasingly reluctant to let go. At first, he respected the boundaries Melanie had set, keeping their relationship confined to stolen moments. But as the months wore on, he began to hint at something more. He spoke of a life where they could be together openly, where Melanie could leave Trevor and start fresh. While his words stirred something deep within her, they also filled her with dread. The stakes were growing higher, and Melanie was running out of time. Deep down, she knew she was playing a dangerous game. But the allure of what Roy represented, freedom, passion, and escape, was too strong to resist. And so, Melanie continued to walk the tightrope, oblivious to just how close she was to falling. Melanie Carter's double life was beginning to unravel. What had once been a thrilling escape from the monotony of her marriage was now spiraling into something far more sinister. Each day, the weight of her secrets grew heavier, threatening to crush the carefully constructed facade of her life. And then the letters began. The first note arrived in her mailbox, slipped between the usual stack of bills and advertisements. Its plain white envelope bore no return address. Melanie assumed it was junk mail until she opened it. Inside, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were the words, "End it now, or you'll regret it." Her heart raced as she read and reread the message, her mind scrambling to make sense of it. Who could have sent it? Did someone know about her affair with Roy? Panic bubbled in her chest, but she quickly shoved the note deep into the trash, unwilling to let it fester in her thoughts. It had to be a prank, she told herself. Nothing more. But the notes didn't stop. Over the following weeks, more letters appeared. Each one was more ominous than the last. I'm watching you. Stop now, or your family will suffer. Melanie began to feel the walls closing in. She found herself looking over her shoulder everywhere she went. Every creak in the house, every shadow in the corner of her eye, felt like a threat. For the first time, the weight of what she had done became unbearable. She had thought she could control the situation, that her affair with Roy could remain her private rebellion against a stifling life. But the letters shattered that illusion. Someone knew, and whoever it was, they weren't going to let her walk away unscathed. Melanie tried to confide in Roy, hoping he could provide reassurance or even a solution. But when she showed him the notes, his reaction was far from comforting. "They're just trying to scare you," he said, brushing it off as though it were a minor inconvenience. "Nobody's going to hurt you. I won't let them." His words, meant to soothe, only unsettled her further. Roy's tone carried a quiet intensity, a determination that bordered on obsession. It was a side of him Melanie hadn't seen before, and it frightened her. For the first time, she wondered if Roy's feelings for her had grown too deep, too consuming. At home, Trevor began to notice the change in Melanie. She had become jumpy, distracted, and withdrawn. She often stared blankly into space, her thoughts miles away. When he asked her what was wrong, she dismissed his concerns with a forced smile and vague excuses about stress and fatigue. But Trevor wasn't convinced. The trust between them, already fragile, was beginning to crack. The strain of living a double life took a toll on every aspect of Melanie's existence. She avoided spending time with Ella and Jack, afraid they might sense the tension radiating off her. She stopped attending PTA meetings and skipped social gatherings, unwilling to face the judgment she imagined in the eyes of her neighbors. The final straw came when she found a note not in her mailbox, but inside her home. She had just returned from running errands when she spotted the folded piece of paper on the kitchen counter. Her hands shook as she opened it. "You think you're safe? Think again." Her knees buckled, and she gripped the counter to steady herself. Whoever was leaving these notes wasn't just watching her, they had been inside her house. The realization sent a chill through her, and for the first time, she felt truly powerless. That night, after locking every door and window, Melanie sat in the darkened living room, clutching a cup of tea she couldn't bring herself to drink. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Was it Roy? A jealous spouse? Someone else entirely? She wanted to go to the police, but the risk of exposing her affair held her back. Melanie's life, once so controlled and predictable, had become a nightmare of her own making. Every choice she made to protect her family seemed to push her closer to the brink of disaster. The letters were no longer just warnings, they were promises. And Melanie knew it was only a matter of time before they were fulfilled. The cracks in Melanie Carter's carefully constructed life were no longer small fissures, they were gaping chasms that threatened to swallow her whole. Trevor Carter, always a practical man, had grown increasingly suspicious. His wife's distant demeanor, the missed family dinners, and the evasive answers to simple questions painted a picture he couldn't ignore. Trevor wasn't a man who liked to jump to conclusions, but his instincts told him something was wrong, deeply wrong. The first undeniable clue came in the form of a credit card statement. Trevor had been reconciling their household expenses when he noticed a series of charges that didn't add up. Motel stays, small but frequent charges at coffee shops, and other inconsistencies made his heart sink. Melanie had mentioned meeting friends for lunch, but these charges didn't align with her stories. A cold knot formed in his stomach, but he said nothing, for now. Trevor decided he needed answers, and he needed them without tipping off Melanie. He contacted a private investigator, a discreet professional known for handling delicate matters like this. Within 2 weeks, the investigator returned with a folder that Trevor almost couldn't bring himself to open. When he finally did, the contents felt like a punch to the gut: photographs of Melanie and Roy Harris, together at motels and lingering too closely in the driveway. The reports detailed their meetings, the timing of her errands, and even snippets of overheard conversations. Trevor stared at the photographs, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage, heartbreak, and betrayal. The woman he had loved for over 15 years, the mother of his children, had been living a life he didn't recognize. It wasn't just the affair, it was the lies, the deception, the sheer audacity of it all. Trevor had always considered himself a patient man, but the emotions churning inside him were anything but patient. He waited until the children were out of the house to confront Melanie. She was in the kitchen, sorting through a stack of mail, when Trevor entered with the folder in his hand. The moment she saw his expression, her body went rigid. "Melanie," he said, his voice cold and steady, "we need to talk." She tried to smile, but it faltered under the intensity of his gaze. "What is it?" Trevor dropped the folder onto the kitchen counter. "This." Melanie's eyes darted to the folder, then back to him. Slowly, she reached for it, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The first photograph froze her in place. Her breath hitched, and the blood drained from her face. "Trevor," she stammered, "I can explain." "Don't," he cut her off, his voice rising. "Don't you dare try to lie to me again. I've been lied to enough." Melanie's defenses crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the edge of the counter for support. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "But it did." Trevor's voice cracked under the weight of his emotions. "You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. How could you do this, Melanie?" The confrontation was raw, filled with anger and sorrow. Trevor demanded answers, and Melanie gave them, her words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. She admitted to the affair, to the moments of weakness that had spiraled out of control. She swore it was over, that she would do whatever it took to repair the damage. But Trevor wasn't ready to forgive. "There's only one way forward," he said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "You end it with him. Completely. Today." Melanie nodded, the weight of his words crushing her. She knew he was right. If there was any hope of saving her marriage, her family, she had to sever ties with Roy once and for all. But the thought of telling Roy filled her with dread. She knew he wouldn't take it well. Later that day, with trembling hands, Melanie dialed Roy's number. When he answered, his voice warm and familiar, she almost couldn't bring herself to speak. "Roy," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone tinged with concern. "It's over," Melanie said, forcing the words out. "I can't see you anymore. I have to focus on my family." Roy's reaction was immediate. "Melanie, no," he said, his voice rising in disbelief. "You don't have to do this. We can make this work. You don't have to stay in a life that doesn't make you happy." "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I have no choice." Roy's tone shifted from pleading to anger. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Melanie hung up, her heart pounding. She had done what Trevor demanded, but the conversation with Roy left her shaken. For the first time, she realized the true depth of his feelings, and the lengths he might go to if he felt pushed too far. That night, as she lay in bed next to Trevor, she felt the gulf between them growing. She had done what he asked, but the damage was done. And in the shadows of her mind, Roy's parting words echoed like a warning she couldn't ignore. Melanie Carter had thought that ending her affair with Roy Harris would bring her some semblance of peace. She believed she could rebuild her marriage, protect her children, and move on from the mistake that had upended her life. But she underestimated Roy. Severing ties with him didn't end the story, it was only the beginning of something far darker. At first, Roy's reaction to the breakup had been unsettling but not overtly threatening. His voice, tinged with anger and disbelief during their final phone call, echoed in her mind for days. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he had said, a warning she couldn't shake. Melanie tried to convince herself that he would let go, that he would move on. But deep down, she knew better. The first time she saw him after the breakup was outside Ella and Jack's school. It was a crisp, chilly afternoon, and Melanie was sitting in her car, waiting for the children to come out. She had just glanced at her phone when something, or someone, caught her eye. Across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, stood Roy. His arms were crossed, his gaze fixed squarely on her car. Her breath hitched, and her heart began to race. What was he doing there? She considered confronting him but thought better of it. Instead, she stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel tightly as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. When Ella and Jack climbed into the car minutes later, Melanie drove away quickly, her hands trembling on the wheel. That encounter set the tone for the weeks that followed. Roy began appearing everywhere Melanie went. At the grocery store, she would catch a glimpse of him in a distant aisle, his presence deliberate but not close enough to force a confrontation. At the coffee shop where she occasionally stopped for a moment of quiet, she would see his truck parked across the street. Even in her own neighborhood, she started noticing his car idling a block away from her house, the shadowy figure inside unmistakable. The constant sightings filled Melanie with dread. She began altering her routines, taking different routes to and from the kids' school, and avoiding her usual haunts. But no matter what she did, Roy always seemed to find her. It wasn't just his presence that unnerved her, it was the way he acted. He never approached her, never spoke to her, but the quiet intensity of his watchful eyes was worse than any confrontation could have been. One evening, as Melanie was locking up the house, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the front porch, tucked into the corner near the door, was a single white flower. At first glance, it seemed innocent, almost thoughtful, until she realized its significance. It was a lily, the same flower Roy had once said reminded him of her. The gesture wasn't romantic, it was a message. He was reminding her that he was still there, still watching. Melanie's anxiety began to consume her. She stopped sleeping through the night, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Every noise outside, every shadow that flickered across the windows, sent her heart pounding. She started checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times each night, but no matter how secure the house felt, she couldn't shake the feeling that Roy was nearby. Finally, she confided in her closest friend, Kate Morgan, over a late-night phone call. Kate listened in horrified silence as Melanie described Roy's behavior, the relentless presence that had turned her life into a waking nightmare. "You have to tell Trevor," Kate urged. "He needs to know what's going on." "I can't," Melanie replied, her voice trembling. "I can't risk him finding out everything. It would destroy what little we have left." Kate was unconvinced. "Melanie, this is serious. If he's stalking you now, who knows what he'll do next?" Melanie knew Kate was right, but the thought of dragging Trevor into the chaos was unbearable. She promised herself she would handle it, though she had no idea how. Roy's behavior escalated further. One afternoon, Melanie returned home from running errands to find a note slipped under her front door. It read, "You think this is over? It's not." The handwriting was familiar, Roy's jagged scrawl, the same as the notes he had left her before. This time, she couldn't dismiss it as empty words. He was making it clear, he wasn't going away. Melanie's fear turned to desperation. She considered going to the police, but the thought of exposing her affair paralyzed her. What would Trevor think? What would happen to Ella and Jack? The very idea of public scrutiny made her stomach churn. As the days turned into weeks, Melanie found herself living in a constant state of hypervigilance. She knew Roy was dangerous, but she couldn't predict his next move. She was trapped, paralyzed by fear and guilt, and Roy knew it. He thrived on the power he held over her, and Melanie could feel that power tightening its grip, inch by inch. She had thought she could control the situation, but the truth was now undeniable. She had lost control, and she was entirely at Roy's mercy. The morning was deceptively calm. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Carter family home, casting long shadows across the front lawn. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as Melanie Carter prepared breakfast for her children. She moved mechanically, her thoughts a blur of fear and exhaustion. The sleepless nights and constant anxiety of being watched had left her drained. But Melanie pushed forward, determined to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Ella and Jack. She had promised herself, and them, that she would keep their world intact, no matter the cost. Melanie didn't notice the figure lurking outside the house. Roy Harris had been there since the early hours of the morning, his truck parked a block away, hidden behind a row of hedges. He sat in silence, watching the house as his mind churned with conflicting emotions, anger, desperation, obsession. He had tried to stay away, but the thought of losing Melanie consumed him. She had been his escape, his lifeline, and now she was slipping through his fingers. In his mind, this wasn't over. It couldn't be. As Melanie let the dog out through the back door, she left it slightly ajar, a habit born of trust in her quiet neighborhood. It was a mistake she wouldn't live to correct. Roy saw his opportunity and seized it. He slipped inside silently, his pulse racing. The familiar layout of the house guided him as he made his way toward the kitchen, where Melanie stood with her back turned, unaware of the danger creeping closer. "Melanie," Roy said, his voice low but sharp. She froze, the spatula slipping from her hand and clattering onto the counter. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "Roy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, stepping closer. There was a wildness in his eyes, a manic intensity that sent a chill down Melanie's spine. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to leave. Now." But Roy didn't move. His expression hardened. "You think you can just walk away from me? After everything?" Melanie's heart pounded as she backed up against the counter, searching for something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. "Please, Roy," she said, her voice breaking. "This isn't right. You need to go." "No," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't get to decide how this ends. Not after what you did." The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Roy lunged forward, grabbing Melanie by the arm. She screamed, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. The struggle turned chaotic, chairs toppling over, dishes shattering as Melanie fought desperately to free herself. Her screams echoed through the house, a piercing cry that woke Ella upstairs. In his frenzy, Roy grabbed a knife from the counter. His movements were erratic, driven by rage and desperation. "You don't get to leave me," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Please." Melanie begged, tears streaming down her face. "Think of my kids. They're upstairs." But Roy was past reason. In one swift motion, he slashed the knife across her throat. The room fell silent except for the sound of Melanie collapsing to the floor. Blood pooled around her as her life slipped away, her wide, terrified eyes fixed on her killer. Roy stood over her, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. His hands trembled, the knife slipping from his grip and clattering onto the floor. He looked down at Melanie's lifeless body, his chest heaving with panic and disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He had only wanted her to listen, to understand. But now, there was no going back. Footsteps on the stairs jolted him from his stupor. Ella, her voice shaky with fear, called out, "Mom? Is everything okay?" Roy bolted. He ran out the way he came, his breath ragged as he sprinted to his truck and sped off, leaving chaos in his wake. Ella reached the kitchen moments later, and the sight before her would haunt her forever. Her mother's body lay crumpled on the floor, the vibrant woman who had tucked her in every night now gone. Ella screamed, her voice filled with pure anguish, as she fumbled for the phone to call 911. Within minutes, the house was swarming with first responders. The once idyllic Carter home was now a crime scene, its walls bearing witness to the violence that had unfolded. Police officers and detectives worked methodically, collecting evidence, while paramedics could only confirm what was already clear: Melanie Carter was gone. As the police pieced together the scene, they found signs of the struggle: the overturned chairs, the shattered dishes, the blood-stained knife bearing Roy's fingerprints. They also discovered Melanie's phone, containing a series of texts and missed calls from Roy in the days leading up to her death. The evidence was overwhelming. By the time the sun was fully up, the Carter family's life had been irrevocably changed. Trevor, called back from his morning meeting, stood in the driveway, his face pale and his eyes hollow as he held Ella and Jack close. His family, his sanctuary, had been destroyed in the most unimaginable way. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Roy Harris was still out there, and Trevor knew he wouldn't rest until justice was served. The investigation into Melanie Carter's murder began immediately, as the tranquil neighborhood buzzed with flashing lights and somber-faced detectives. Inside the Carter home, officers meticulously catalogued the signs of the violent struggle: the overturned chairs, shattered plates, and the blood-soaked knife left on the floor. Each piece of evidence painted a grim picture of Melanie's final moments. But it was the knife, marked with Roy Harris's fingerprints, that confirmed the identity of her killer. Detectives wasted no time piecing together the events leading up to Melanie's death. Trevor Carter, pale and visibly shaken, provided them with the backstory that tied everything together. With his voice wavering, he revealed Melanie's affair with Roy, her attempts to end it, and the terrifying escalation that followed. He handed over the threatening notes Melanie had hidden, now evidence of Roy's growing obsession. The texts and calls from Roy found on Melanie's phone cemented the case against him. In the days before her murder, Roy had bombarded Melanie with messages, ranging from desperate pleas to chilling warnings. One text, sent just hours before her death, read, "You can't ignore me forever. I'm coming." It was a damning piece of evidence that left no doubt about his intentions. With an arrest warrant in hand, authorities launched a manhunt for Roy Harris. He had fled the scene, but his escape wasn't well planned. Just 2 days after the murder, police tracked him to a seedy motel on the outskirts of the city. He was alone, sitting on the edge of the bed, his clothes disheveled and his eyes hollow. When officers burst into the room, he didn't resist. He seemed resigned, as though he had been waiting for them. During his interrogation, Roy initially denied his involvement. He claimed he had gone to the Carter home to talk to Melanie, not to harm her. But when faced with the mountain of evidence, his fingerprints on the knife, the texts, and the eyewitness account of Ella Carter hearing his voice, his facade cracked. Eventually, Roy confessed, though he insisted it wasn't premeditated. "I didn't mean to do it," he muttered, his head in his hands. "I just wanted her to listen." The confession sealed his fate. On the heels of the arrest, the district attorney announced that Roy Harris would face charges of first-degree murder. The case quickly gained media attention, with news outlets covering every detail of the tragic affair-turned-homicide. The story of the seemingly perfect suburban wife, her secret lover, and her untimely death captivated the public, turning the trial into a spectacle. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, community members, and legal professionals crowded in to witness the proceedings. Trevor Carter took the stand, his voice steady but laced with emotion as he recounted the events leading up to Melanie's death. He spoke about her affair with Roy, her attempts to end it, and her growing fear in the weeks before her murder. "I didn't know how much danger she was in," he said, his voice breaking. "If I had, I would have done more to protect her." Detectives and forensic experts presented the physical evidence, laying out a clear and damning timeline of Roy's actions. The threatening notes, the fingerprints on the murder weapon, and the text messages painted a picture of a man whose obsession had spiraled into violence. The most emotional testimony came from Ella Carter, who described hearing Roy's voice that morning and the moment she found her mother's body. Her words brought many in the courtroom to tears, underscoring the devastating impact of the crime on the Carter family. Roy's defense team argued that the murder wasn't premeditated, claiming it was a crime of passion. They portrayed him as a man overcome by his emotions, driven to a breaking point. But the prosecution countered with evidence of his calculated behavior, the stalking, the notes, and the escalating threats. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before reaching their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. When the sentence was read, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Trevor felt a bittersweet sense of relief. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Melanie back. As Roy was led away in handcuffs, he showed no emotion. The man who had once professed love for Melanie was now a shadow of himself, consumed by the consequences of his own obsession. For the Carter family, the trial's conclusion marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a long road toward healing. In the days following the trial, Trevor focused on rebuilding his family's life. He knew the wounds from Melanie's death would take years to heal, especially for Ella and Jack. But he also knew they couldn't be defined by the tragedy. With quiet determination, he vowed to honor Melanie's memory by protecting and nurturing the family she had loved so deeply. The Carter home, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, had been tainted by violence and loss. But Trevor was resolute. He would ensure that it became a place of safety again, a promise to his children and to himself that, no matter how long it took, they would find peace. The trial of Roy Harris had ended, and justice, in the eyes of the law, had been served. Sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Roy would never again walk free. For the Carter family, the verdict provided some closure, but it did little to heal the deep wounds left behind. Trevor Carter, standing in the courtroom as the judge handed down the sentence, felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but it was replaced by an emptiness that he wasn't sure would ever go away. In the days that followed, the once vibrant Carter household was a shadow of what it had been. The home felt quieter, heavier, as though the walls themselves mourned the loss of Melanie Carter. Ella and Jack, too young to fully grasp the complexities of what had happened, struggled in their own ways. Ella, the more introspective of the two, withdrew into herself, spending hours alone in her room. Jack, on the other hand, lashed out, his grief manifesting as anger at the world. Trevor knew he had to be strong for his children, even as his own heart broke. Each day was a struggle to maintain a sense of normalcy, to provide the stability that had been ripped away from them. He found himself taking on roles that Melanie had so effortlessly managed, making breakfast, packing lunches, attending school events, all while trying to navigate his own sorrow. Despite his efforts, Trevor couldn't help but question everything. What could he have done differently? Should he have acted sooner when he noticed Melanie's behavior change? Could he have saved her if he had paid closer attention? These questions plagued him, their answers elusive and cruel. The community, once a source of comfort, now felt like an invasive presence. Neighbors whispered as Trevor passed, their sympathy tinged with morbid curiosity. The story of Melanie's affair and her tragic death had spread far beyond their quiet neighborhood, amplified by the media's fascination with the case. Strangers who had never met Melanie speculated about her choices, casting judgments from afar. For Trevor, the hardest part was explaining everything to Ella and Jack. He struggled to find the words to explain their mother's actions without tarnishing her memory. She had made mistakes, yes, but she had also been a loving and devoted mother. He wanted his children to remember her for the woman who had tucked them in at night, cheered them on at soccer games, and filled their home with warmth, not the victim of a crime or the subject of public scrutiny. One evening, months after the trial, Trevor sat down with Ella in the dimly lit living room. She had been distant, her eyes filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. Taking a deep breath, Trevor spoke. "It's okay to be angry," he said softly. "At me, at Mom, at everything that's happened. But don't let it define you. Your mom wouldn't want that." Ella's voice cracked as she replied, "I just don't understand why she did it. Why wasn't what we had enough?" Trevor wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Sometimes, people make mistakes because they feel lost, even when they're surrounded by love. It doesn't mean she didn't love us, Ella. She did. More than anything." As the weeks turned into months, the Carter family began to find small moments of solace. Trevor started taking the kids to a grief counseling group, where they could speak openly about their feelings without fear of judgment. The sessions were hard, often leaving them emotionally raw, but they also brought clarity and a sense of community. In quieter moments, Trevor allowed himself to grieve privately. He would sit in the backyard, staring at the stars, and speak to Melanie in his mind. He told her about Ella's first attempts at playing guitar, Jack's newfound love for baseball, and how much he missed her laughter filling the house. He didn't know if she could hear him, but it brought him peace nonetheless. The memory of Roy Harris lingered like a dark shadow, but Trevor refused to let it consume him. He wouldn't allow the man who had taken Melanie's life to steal any more from them. Instead, he focused on the future, a future where Ella and Jack could grow up without fear, where their lives wouldn't be defined by tragedy. In time, the Carter home began to feel less like a crime scene and more like a sanctuary again. There were still scars, invisible but ever-present, and there always would be. But with each passing day, Trevor and his children found ways to honor Melanie's memory, not by dwelling on how she died, but by remembering how she lived. As Trevor tucked Jack into bed one night, his son asked, "Do you think Mom's watching us?" Trevor smiled, his eyes misting. "I do," he said. "And I think she'd be proud of us." The path ahead wasn't easy, but it was theirs to walk. And as the Carter family moved forward, they carried Melanie's love with them, a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of life.